We have about 15 minutes to field any questions you might have.
Yes. Yeah, hi, could you give us a sense of...
Oh, you can say who you are for the sake of the audience too, that'd be great.
Oh, I'm Andrew Sandoval-Strauss, University of New Mexico. I'll be presenting this afternoon. Could you give us a sense of how these folks are being integrated or not integrated politically? Because you have this, or at least I had the sense in the sort of 80s and early 90s of the rest of America discovering Latinos as sort of a politically relevant group of people. How does it look in these communities?
Sure. In one of the cities we looked at, Passaic, they elected a Puerto Rican mayor, and this was the first mayor of a city of, I think, the size of 50, 60,000 that had elected Latino leader as its mayor. So in some of these cities, Latinos are being politically active. Other cities, not so much. I can't really say I looked into too much comparison or Bridgeport.
I have focused most of my work on looking at the city of Boston because there were so many different suburban communities. It was hard to take them all into account and understand their political systems. In general, I would say that these suburban communities have not done as good a job at encouraging and integrating immigrants into the governance. And some of that has to do with the structure of governance in suburban communities. The cities have been a little bit better. Chelsea certainly has had some Latinos on the city council, but for a city that is minority Latino, it's a minority representation. The one city in Massachusetts that has had a strong Latino presence is Lawrence. Elected their first mayor there, second Latino mayor now, and the first, unfortunately, got caught up in all kinds of scandal that brought him down. But and it's been, you know, the typical problems of a town like Lawrence that has so many problems with its schools and its infrastructure, and you know, inheriting basically. Immigrants inheriting towns that are so troubled that it's hard to make them function, and pretty soon, you know, there's a whole other set of problems. I think the story in Boston has been more encouraging, though, and even though we actually just recently elected a new mayor who is the son of Irish immigrants from a very mixed part of the city, Dorchester, who had widespread support from many immigrant groups in the city, and this campaign, recent campaign, saw all of the candidates lobbying for the support of the foreign-born, and especially the second generation. Who's, I think that's really been the turning point. It's the second generation people who are voting, and they're the ones who are starting to really have some impact in Boston. I think it's going to take a little bit of a silence.
Yes. You mentioned affordable housing, both of you, at one point or another, and I would submit that I think affordable housing is the quintessential issue that all of these things for revitalization are built on. And so what are your different definitions for that? I know it must change by whatever the region is, but is there something that you can all agree on, and what does that look like?
Yeah, sure. And again, it's regional. New Jersey versus Detroit, affordable housing is different. But from the analysis I did, the housing in the cities, monthly rent was usually a couple $100 less than the surrounding areas. So while, and I think for Patterson, I think the average, just using census and ACS data, is I think like $900 a month. Does that median gross rent? While I think in the surrounding other suburbs, it was like $1,200, $1,300. Granted, that covers a wide range of apartments and houses, but it was generally more in comparison to the surrounding areas for my research.
I think zoning has been really important, and the three communities that I looked at, you know, continued to build well, certainly they already had a tradition of building low-income housing. They all took advantage of public housing programs in the 50s and 60s. Malden, for instance, I discovered it because Malden suddenly came into onto my radar in the midst of doing this. It wasn't initially one of the communities I was going to look at, and then when I saw the numbers that were skyrocketing after 2000, I started to look more closely, and I discovered that they had the largest redevelopment program in Massachusetts, second only to Boston. They built thousands and thousands of housing units in the post-war period, and a lot of that housing now is where new immigrants are living. Then they continue to build housing around the Orange Line, as also happened in Quincy, and both cities built tens of thousands of multifamily units around the subway stops, and well into the 70s. Now, eventually, they followed the patterns of most of the other suburban communities with implementing, various snob zoning type measures that have made it difficult to build more of that kind of housing. But they were real beacons, I think, in promoting multifamily housing. And I think an important thing here is why history is so important is these kinds of industrial communities that had large working class populations really fought hard on the local level for against that kind of zoning. And after World War II, when the GI generation was coming back, there wasn't enough housing. There was a lot of veterans housing that was built, and then public housing that was built, and it was an empowered, European immigrant generation and with factories were still open at that point, that was really fighting for those kinds of housing and against these sort of zoning measures that were being enacted in towns around them. So for me, I don't have any exact rent levels, but it's that kind of political landscape that enabled the multifamily housing to be a reality there.
Bob Lockhart, University of Pennsylvania Press. It seems like each of you were sort of grappling with the idea of what is revitalization. What does it look like? And it seems like one potential sort of valuable theme or purpose that could come from this conference is sort of toward a definition of revitalization. And I'm wondering, Stanton offered some ideas, some suggestions, wondering what you all, how you all might react to that. What does a revitalized community of immigrants look like for you?
Well, I think you have better standards on this than I do, so I'll let you start and then I'll...
As I spoke about earlier, I think first it starts with populations. We also looked a lot at crime as well, and crime rates dropped a significant amount. Economically, the poverty rates usually aren't quite there, just because of the way the statistics are collected. But it's just like going down, and when you drive down Main Street in Patterson, you see almost no vacancies, and you notice the cities, it's not boarded up. It doesn't look like, you don't see a lot of bombed out buildings. You see people living there, taking care of the communities. And while that's not as maybe quantitatively or as easy of a standard to apply, that's what Professor Katz and I look for.
Yeah, I think I've been a little more skeptical about the revitalization idea for some of these communities, and although I haven't taken a heavily statistical approach, I haven't even really thought about this issue in great detail prior to focusing on this paper. But if you take one of the worst case scenario cities in Massachusetts, which is not in my area, is outside of my area, is Lawrence, which is a heavily Latino, more than 3/4 Latino population now. It's just a few miles from the New Hampshire border. It's not where you would expect to find such a large Latino population, but it's been growing rapidly since the 60s. And Chelsea would be, Chelsea and Lynn would be similar examples. These are, some of the gateway cities of Massachusetts that continue to have very serious problems and very high rates of poverty. Some of them have had their school districts taken over by the state. There's not a lot of encouraging news necessarily on those fronts, and they seem to be places that immigrants want to get away from as soon as they can afford to, and that's why places like Malden and Everett and other communities around Chelsea have been growing. And I think some of the indicators you have to be really careful of, and I think crime is a great example, right? If you have communities that have large numbers of undocumented immigrants or refugees or other traumatized groups who are not comfortable going to the police, a lot of crime is not being recorded. So I'm not sure I have a lot of faith necessarily in those kinds of measures. Done a lot of research on policing in the past, and I know that statistics can be very, very misleading on that. So I think a lot of this is sort of a gut sense of just walking around some of these different towns and seeing they're clearly in the sense of population, these cities are being repopulated, and that's a good thing, and it's making housing available that's more affordable. And certainly some of the more lively downtowns, even in a city like Lawrence, that is a much more vital place on the streets than it used to be 30 years ago. But exactly how far that goes in really revitalizing the economy and providing better paying jobs and improving the education system, that may be happening in the future, but I'm not convinced it's quite there yet. But some of these other communities very much so.
Hi, I'm Gary Painter from USC High School, and my comment was related to that and trying to understand, what you've observed in the Boston suburbs between the communities that, are still, disadvantaged in many ways from the one step up. Mm-hmm. And you kind of threw out some ideas, maybe transit, maybe something else in those communities that allowed them to be the one step up communities. And so one of the narratives I've heard is a lot of people look at transit, but you mentioned zoning, but it's really that transit actually allows for the change in zoning and these kinds of things. Yeah. So I don't know how much in terms of the narrative you've been able to kind of separate out mechanisms that have allowed, a Malden to have a different trajectory from a Chelsea, and obviously affordable housing like ties into all that. You've been able to kind of start to get a sense of that. I mean, I know your analytics, you haven't asked that specific question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, transit makes a huge difference in the sense that, I've been absolutely astounded at some of the immigrants I've talked to who've worked in ESL programs and other community centers, and finding out the amount of time that people spend traveling to jobs, and often multiple jobs. They can spend almost as much time commuting as working during as part-time jobs, and I think it makes a big difference if you're on a T-line that is able to get you to your work relatively quickly. So I do think that's an important one, and it's the studies that have been done with the East Asian populations, Chinese and Vietnamese in particular, in Quincy, that were done back in the 80s, identified, the number one reason people said that they were that they chose Quincy was because of the Red Line and the ease of access to getting to Chinatown, which is where most of the jobs were at that time, either in the garment industries or the restaurant industry. So I think that is really key. Framingham presents something a little different in that you have, I think there is a train line. It too, I started seeing these layers and layers of kind of infrastructure and institutions left over from an earlier industrial era that have been kind of retooled and reused. So Framingham has a commuter train line. I don't think a lot of immigrants, working class immigrants, are necessarily commuting that way. A lot of the Brazilian population there are self-employed in cleaning businesses and contracting and other things that are mainly in the surrounding suburbs. But I do think that the infrastructure that's been provided there in terms of housing and downtown areas for businesses, and combined with this explosion in another end of town of all this retail and service employment, has been a good fit So you almost have a sort of post-war suburban economy on the one hand, and then an older industrial economy that's been retooled for immigrants, and those two things have worked well together.
We're running out of time. If you guys would just pose your questions, and we'll let the presenters address them individually and collectively.
My question about the big picture quiz, the big picture question, it's three factors. I wonder if you could address it. Number one, the use of you mentioned how we have low reservation for the low wage earner. I wonder if you could consider the leveraging, the ability of the immigrant of leveraging that very low wage. For example, you work very hard, you get your $10,000, you go to Mexico, you get yourself a small farm, you come back, you know what I mean? So this money is being, it works a lot in the hand of an immigrant. Then the use of a leverage, the use of an anchor child, you could just get your high school diploma, then you go overseas, you get yourself a very good degree. Then you come back to the United States, just straight to get your master. So the leveraging of that low income earning in the hand of an immigrant, it means a lot. The second thing, the drug money and its role in leveraging the Mexican immigrant community. It has been rated very soon that the drug money, the drug that we have, at least in this region, it's coming straight from Mexico, and Mexican drugs coming from Canada too. So there's two routes. It's not no, it's the least cheap. Please God, I was listening to NPR and he said that after. So this money is very, very difficult to go back to Mexico. So this money is actually must be used in the United States. So that is the second thing. The third thing, the desperate need, our desperate need of poor, working poor, in order for us to move to the suburb. We need somebody to buy our old houses. In order for us to get decent cars, we need somebody to fix the old one and buy and use it. So the three factors, I wonder if you just put it in your...
Ben Kissinger from Penn Design, and I just want to quickly observe that you all focused on pull sort of cities, like attracting cities, but you briefly mentioned zoning, the role of zoning in terms of maybe pushing or excluding, but I also said, and you mentioned discrimination to some extent, so I wonder to what extent we can explain the push and pull as sort of a residential choice in a more holistic system.
That.
I'm Maya, I'm from GLC, and this is more directed to Rosa. I wanted to know your perspective on how immigrant education interplays with revitalization, and also in looking at Hispanic students as not model minority students, how educators can better understand that.
Yeah, I'm Alex Rankin, I'm from the School of Design as well. I have another education question. I guess my question is, how has the second generation influenced the public education system in these areas? And I know in Chelsea, Boston University became involved with their system. Have there been private institutions? Has that worked in your opinion? Is that applicable to other cities like this?
Phil Casson is from City University of New York. All of the areas that you're discussing, that you're describing, are older, once immigrant receiving places in larger metropolitan areas. They're not, right in the middle of the country or something. They're all part of those large metro areas. And it seemed to me that, on the one hand, while there is a repopulation and, for lack of a better word, revitalization happening in all these places, it's going on along with extremely long commuting, which is something Professor Johnson mentioned, and kind of a change in the way metropolitan areas function. Like our definition of what's a viable commute seems to be getting very different. People are attracted for low cost housing and these rather unusual islands in suburbia where they actually have either decent mass transit or cheap housing. there also seems to be something of a, what Hiram Blumenrod called suburban free riding going on. That you've got lots of other communities that don't provide housing or social services to people like this, but are actually living off their labor at this point within these same metro areas. So are we seeing a kind of new kind of inequality based on historical infrastructure questions within our metropolitan areas?
The presenter would like to address these points briefly.
A tall order.
Education is an interesting question. In the town that I study, the American-born kids are just starting to hit the school system. So it's very early in that process of the kids getting there. And to answer your question, it depends an awful lot because the kids seem to the teachers very different depending on what age they started, where they came from. And so there are dramatic differences. A Mexican kid is not a Mexican kid. There's a whole range of different kinds of kids who present, and teachers see them differently. It's high school and elementary school are very different. The elementary school tends to be more nurturing, welcoming of kids speaking their own language, for example, whereas the high school is too standards focused and doesn't like that. But unfortunately, education is too big a topic to handle in maybe 5 minutes.
I will just briefly say, yes, I agree with the question. I think this is very true. I think it's somewhat masked by the fact that there are a lot of high-skilled immigrants who are living in the suburbs. So, you know, people where I live in Brookline will say, oh, you know, we have plenty of immigrants, you know, but other than public housing, we at least have public housing, which many suburban communities don't. There aren't a lot of places for working-class immigrants to live. The other thing I would say about the whole commuting phenomenon, which is something that's very different from the last wave of immigrants, is that people spend so much time commuting that it really has had an impact on their ability to integrate into communities. And studies, very detailed studies that were done in Quincy in the 1980s, talking about interviewing Vietnamese and Chinese immigrants there who said they had a lot of violence there in the 1980s against immigrants who were moving in, and it's kind of post-Vietnam era, so it was particularly pointed. But a lot of the immigrants would say, you know, I don't know anybody here. I don't have time. You know, I'm working 12 hours a day in a restaurant in Chinatown. You know, I work 6 or 7 days a week. No time to get to know the neighbors. I come home, I eat, I go to bed, I get up, I go back to Chinatown. So, and I think that is the life of many. Many of the Brazilian house cleaners are on the road all day long, and it's difficult to get a level of integration. Some of your people spoke to that in the film also.
To address a few of the questions. In terms of inequality, one interesting factor which I didn't look terribly into my research is the distribution of just tax dollars. I mean, the local and state governments usually get hit a lot harder, while the federal government has a big tax surplus from immigrants, especially if you take Social Security. I mean, if you're looking at undocumented immigrants, if you have fake Social Security, you obviously can't pull that money out later if the government doesn't bring you a check back, unfortunately, saying, hey, here's all the Social Security taxes you paid for those undocumented immigrants who are working jobs which is not their table. As to address some of your questions, we didn't look a lot into how out-migration. I think a larger pattern was during the recent economic downturn, the Great Recession. A lot of it appeared that a lot of undocumented immigrants left the country. Whether or not I think in Patterson, after talking to a few people, they did say that the population did decline right after the economic downturn. In terms of the drug money, we have no idea how that type of businesses influence Patterson. I mean, to say it's not there is probably being exceptionally naive, but we don't know its influence. And to address I just need a vehicle to sort of move out to the suburbs. That's one of the lack of that's one of the reasons some of these businesses, like the Jitney business that I talked about being in my presentation, and that's reasons that's popped up is just that need for the type of transportation, which as does that type of infrastructure is not in New Jersey is the same as in Boston.
I'd like to thank Kenneth and our staff for their